The commander's voice was iron, his decision final, but in the back of the room, a lone analyst saw what he couldn't. A digital ghost in the machine, a death trap laid in ones and zeros. Hours later, the screen went black, and the only sound was the commander's ragged breath as he slammed his headset down, his world collapsing around him. "Who the hell is she?" he roared. The answer would change the future of warfare forever. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The Joint Operations Center was a cavern, a digital cathedral consecrated to the modern gods of war. Its air, chilled to protect the humming server racks that lined its walls, was thick with the low thrum of immense processing power and the scent of stale coffee and nervous energy. Light was a scarce commodity, offered only by the glow of 100 monitors and the vast topographical map projected onto the central screen. It was a world of shadows and data, where the fates of men in faraway lands were decided by quiet conversations and the click of a mouse. In this dimly lit sanctuary, Analyst Leah Torres was an anomaly. Dressed in a simple gray pantsuit and a crisp white blouse, she sat at a secondary console, away from the polished mahogany of the main briefing table where the uniformed brass congregated. Her posture was perfectly straight, a stark contrast to the weary slouches of the men who had been living in this room for days. Her entire being was focused on the complex river of data flowing across her triple monitor setup, her fingers moving with quiet, economical precision across her keyboard. Pacing before the central screen was SEAL Commander Wyatt Thorne. In his early 40s, he was a man carved from granite and impatience, his powerful build contained within a flight suit that seemed too small for his coiled energy. He radiated an authority that was more than just rank. It was earned in the dust of a dozen failed states and the cold waters of hostile shores. His face, a mask of intense focus, was illuminated by the glowing map of a remote mountain range in Afghanistan, a place where his men were scheduled to deliver violence and disappear before sunrise. He moved with a predator's grace, his boots making soft, rhythmic taps on the floor that set a tempo of urgency for the entire room. Near the back, leaning against a server rack with his arms crossed, Colonel Jacobs watched the proceedings. In his late 50s, Jacobs was a study in calm observation, his gaze missing nothing. He noted the sycophantic nods of the junior officers around the table and the dismissive arrogance in Thorne's posture. His eyes, however, kept flicking towards the quiet analyst in the corner, a silent acknowledgement of the other form of power present in the room. "The intel is clear," Thorne's voice cut through the low hum, each word a steel pellet. "Scattered hostiles, minimal resistance. Their command structure is in disarray. We go in hard and fast through the Serpent's Tooth Valley, hit the target, and we're exfil before the sun is a rumor. Speed and shock and awe, gentlemen. That's the plan." He swept his gaze across the faces at the table, his expression daring anyone to find a flaw. Questions? It was a rhetorical gesture, a final stamp of his authority on the operation. He expected silence, and for a moment, he got it. Then, a slight movement in the periphery. Leah Torres, without looking up from her screen, had raised a hand, a gesture so small it was almost lost in the shadows. A young aide, eager to prove his worth, leaned towards Thorne and pointed. "Commander, Analyst Torres has a point." Thorne's head snapped in her direction, his eyes narrowing. The interruption, the breach in protocol from a civilian analyst, was a visible annoyance. He had a schedule to keep, and men's lives depended on it. "Analyst," he clipped out, the single word a clear dismissal. Leah's focus finally broke from her screens. She turned, her expression calm, her voice steady and devoid of emotion. Yet it carried an unshakable clarity that cut through the commander's irritation. "Commander, my predictive analysis model, the grid, indicates a 92% probability of a complex ambush within that valley." She swiveled one of her monitors, and with a few keystrokes, a new image appeared on a secondary screen on the main wall. It was a stunningly detailed three-dimensional model of the Serpent's Tooth Valley. The recent lack of chatter isn't a sign of weakness, but of disciplined preparation. The data suggests they're baiting us. Her model highlighted a specific choke point, a narrow passage where the terrain offered multiple overlapping fields of fire from elevated positions. Red lines, representing enemy sight lines, crisscrossed the valley floor, creating a perfect kill box. The grid projects, they will let you get deep into the choke point before they close the trap from both ends. She manipulated the image, showing an alternate route, a longer, more arduous climb along a high ridge to the east. This approach is more difficult. It will add at least an hour to your insertion time, but it offers tactical superiority. You'd be approaching from above, avoiding the kill box entirely. A low murmur went through the room. Thorne stared at the 3D model, his jaw tight. He then let out a short, sharp sound, a scoff that was both a laugh and a growl. He gestured dismissively at her screen, a grand sweep of his hand that took in all her data, all her careful projections. "With all due respect, Analyst," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "my men aren't afraid of a climb, but we're on a clock. We deal in ground truth, not percentages and algorithms from a machine. Your grid," he said the word as if it were a child's toy, "doesn't account for the skill and lethality of a SEAL team. It doesn't account for the human element, for will, for the fact that we are better trained, better equipped, and more ruthless than anyone they can put in those hills." He turned his back on her, facing the main screen again, his decision made. "We stick to the plan." The finality in his tone was absolute. The murmuring stopped. The officers at the table nodded in agreement, their faith in their commander unshaken. Leah slowly turned back to her console, the projected image on the wall vanishing. A familiar wave of frustration washed over her. But it was not born of personal insult. It was a deeper, colder feeling. A frustration with an institutional resistance to data that could save lives. She saw for a fleeting moment the face of her brother, a Marine lost to a preventable IED in a dusty Anbar province town. That loss had been the catalyst, the ghost that drove her to create this system, a way to find the patterns in the chaos, to see the threats before they materialized. She had poured her grief and her genius into the glowing lines of code, into the intricate evolving entity she called the grid, hoping to prevent other families from feeling the void that had consumed hers. The system was more than an algorithm, it was a promise Thorne had just thrown back in her face. From his position, Colonel Jacobs saw the slight tightening of Leah's jaw, the only outward sign of her reaction. He also saw the look on Thorne's face. It wasn't just confidence, it was something more dangerous. Pride. Thorne saw a young analyst, a civilian who had never smelled cordite or felt the ground shake from a mortar strike, trying to tell him how to do his job. He felt the immense pressure of command, the crushing weight of the lives in his hands, and in that moment, he chose to trust the battle-hardened experience that had served him for 2 decades. He trusted his gut. He trusted the warrior's instinct that told him the valley was the right path. To him, Leah's data was an abstraction, a sterile set of probabilities that couldn't possibly comprehend the brutal, tangible reality of the battlefield. He was a man of action, and the data was telling him to hesitate, to take the long way around. It was advice he was incapable of taking. Jacobs' own jaw tightened. He had seen this before, this clash between old ways and new, between instinct and information, and he had seen it end in disaster. He held his tongue, but his silence was a heavy thing in the humming, electric air of the war room. The decision was made, the machine was in motion, and in the quiet corner of the room, a lone analyst watched a clock count down, her screen glowing with a 92% certainty that she was about to be proven right in the most terrible way imaginable. The helicopter, a black beast of composite materials and roaring turbines, shuddered as it carved through the thin, frigid air. Inside its dark, vibrating belly, the men of Trident Team were islands of calm in a sea of violent noise. Bathed in the dim, spectral red of the cabin lights, they performed their final gear checks with an economy of motion that bordered on surgical. There was the soft click of a magazine seating into a rifle, the rustle of a strap being tightened, the quiet hiss of a hydration tube being tested. Their faces, painted in jagged patterns of black and green camouflage, were impassive masks of focus. They were a brotherhood forged in shared hardship, their camaraderie and unspoken language conveyed in a glance, a nod, a shared, steadying breath. At their head was Raptor, the team leader. He felt the familiar thrum of the aircraft in his bones, a sensation that was as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. He trusted the commander's plan. The route was textbook, a direct artery to the heart of the target. He felt the familiar cocktail of adrenaline and hyper-focused calm flood his system. Sharpening his senses, But there was no specific premonition of danger, no cold prickle on his neck. It was just another night, another mission, just another walk in the park. 30 seconds, the crew chief's voice crackled in their headsets. The ramp lowered, revealing a breathtaking, terrifying vista. A moonlit landscape of jagged peaks and deep shadows unfolded below, a world of silver and black. The wind, a physical entity, tore into the cabin, smelling of pine, cold rock, and the vast empty space between mountains. Without a word, the team moved. One by one, they slid down the thick, fast ropes, their descent controlled and silent, their forms swallowed by the darkness the moment their boots touched the gravelly earth. The helicopter, its purpose served, banked sharply and roared away, its sound fading until it was just another whisper in the wind. Silence descended, profound and absolute. "Raptor, feet dry," he sub-vocalized into his throat mic, his voice a low rasp. "Copy," came the acknowledgement from the JOC, a distant tinny voice from another world, moving to waypoint Alpha. They moved like wraiths, their progress swift and professional, melting into the shadows of the towering rock formations. The terrain was exactly as the briefing maps had shown, a rugged but manageable path leading into the maw of the Serpent's Tooth Valley. The air was thin here, each breath a conscious effort, the cold biting at any exposed skin. One of the younger team members, call sign Rookie, moved up beside a veteran named Grizzly. "Just another walk in the park," Rookie whispered, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Grizzly grunted, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines above them. "Yeah, a cold one. Keep your eyes open." Raptor overheard the exchange, and a flicker of a smile touched his lips beneath his camouflage paint. The kid was good, but he was still green enough to feel the need to talk. Grizzly would keep him straight. His own focus returned to the path ahead, his mind a cool, clear instrument of war. The plan was simple. The intel was solid. The team was the best in the world. There was no reason to doubt, no cause for concern. He put one foot in front of the other, leading his men deeper into the valley, deeper into the waiting silence. Back in the JOC, the atmosphere had shifted. The frantic energy of the pre-mission briefing had subsided into a quieter, more watchful tension. Most of the staff were focused on the main screen, where the progress of Trident Team was displayed as a series of friendly blue icons moving steadily along the valley floor. The icons pulsed with a reassuring rhythm, each beat a confirmation that all was well. The comms were quiet, save for the occasional clipped check-in. Everything appeared normal. Everything was going according to plan. Commander Thorne stood with his arms crossed, a small, satisfied smile playing on his lips. He watched the blue icons advance, each pixel a vindication of his decision, a testament to his experience. The plan was working. The analyst had been wrong. It reinforced his core belief in his own judgment, in the primacy of a commander's gut feeling over the cold, sterile logic of a machine. He felt a surge of pride, not just in himself, but in his men, who were out there executing his vision with flawless professionalism. Leah Torres, however, was not looking at the main screen. She had turned her chair slightly, creating a small, private world for herself and her 3 monitors. To her, the main screen was a lie, a comforting illusion that masked a terrifying reality. Her focus was entirely on her own console, where the grid was processing a torrent of information far beyond what the standard sensors were designed to see. It was sifting through thousands of micro data points, information that was invisible to anyone else. It analyzed subtle atmospheric changes, noting a fractional increase in carbon dioxide levels in the valley that was inconsistent with natural patterns. It registered minute seismic readings from distant buried sensors, detecting faint, rhythmic vibrations that were not geological in origin, but biological, the collective, unconscious shifting of hundreds of hidden men. It parsed the background radiation of the area, finding anomalies in the electromagnetic spectrum, faint ghosts of powered, down electronics waiting for a signal. Her system, which had started at a 92% probability of ambush, began to scream. The number climbed with sickening speed, 97%. The system flagged the atmospheric data, cross-referencing it with the thermal output of the valley, 98%. The seismic sensors registered a coordinated micro-shift, as if an entire force was settling into its final firing positions. 99%. Red warning icons, small but insistent, began to flash on her screen, unseen by anyone else in the room. The grid was no longer predicting, it was stating a fact. The trap was set. Colonel Jacobs, who had been watching Thorne's smug satisfaction with a growing sense of unease, pushed himself off the server rack and walked silently over to Leah's station. He didn't speak, but stood behind her, his gaze taking in her screen, then her face. He saw the almost imperceptible tension in her jaw, the rigid set of her shoulders. He saw the flashing red icons that painted a picture of impending doom. "Still believe it?" he asked, his voice a low murmur, meant only for her. Leah didn't take her eyes off the screen. Her own voice was tight, strained, the sound of a wire stretched to its breaking point. "I know it, Colonel." She pointed a trembling finger at a section of her display where the data had coalesced into a terrifying visual. The enemy wasn't a collection of red dots, but a spreading amoeba-like probability stain that bled across the topographical map, covering the valley walls on both sides of the SEAL's path. It showed their dispersal, their interlocking fields of fire, the sheer, overwhelming scale of the force waiting in the darkness. "They're walking right into it. The system is screaming. It's a classic baited hook ambush. They're letting them get deep into the choke point, past the point of no return, before they close the trap." Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. It felt like watching a car crash in slow motion, the screech of tires replaced by the silent, inexorable climb of a percentage point. She ran a full diagnostic on the grid for the third time, a desperate silent prayer for a system error, a flaw in her code, a single corrupted data packet, anything that would make her wrong. But the math was relentless, perfect, and cruel. The system was working exactly as she had designed it. A wave of helpless responsibility washed over her. She didn't know their names, but she saw their faces, the confident camouflaged men from the satellite feed, and she felt as if she were the one leading them to their deaths. The weight of her certainty was a physical thing, a crushing pressure in her chest. She was the only person in the world who knew what was about to happen, and she was powerless to stop it. She could only watch and wait for the screaming to start. The team moved deeper into the serpent's tooth, and the valley walls began to press in, rising like sheer black cliffs on either side. The path narrowed, forcing them into a single file line. It was a natural choke point, a place that felt ancient and menacing. Raptor, at the head of the column, felt a sudden, prickling unease crawl up the back of his neck. It wasn't a sound or a sight, but a feeling, a change in the texture of the silence. The normal, subtle noises of the night, the whisper of wind through the scrub brush, the distant call of a nocturnal animal had all ceased. The silence that remained was not peaceful. It was a vacuum, a held breath. It was the deep, unnatural quiet of a predator, waiting patiently for its prey to step just a little further into the snare. He slowed his pace, his senses screaming, scanning the oppressive rock faces above. They were perfect textbook firing positions. Too perfect. In the JOC, the helmet cam feed from Raptor's position filled one of the smaller screens. It showed the exact terrain Leah had modeled hours before. There, to the left, was the gnarled fallen trunk of an ancient petrified tree, its shape unmistakable. To the right, a distinctive rock formation that resembled a hooded figure, just as the grid had rendered it in its three-dimensional projection. Thorne, still watching the main map, missed it, but Colonel Jacobs saw it, and his blood ran cold. He looked from the screen to Leah, whose face was a pale, grim mask illuminated by the glow of her console. She knew. She was watching her own prophecy unfold in real time. On Raptor's feed, a flicker. It was almost nothing, a single pixel shifting on the very edge of the camera's view, a shadow detaching itself from a larger shadow high up on the canyon wall. It was a flicker of movement where there should have been none. Raptor's brain had just enough time to register the anomaly, to form the word contact, but the word never left his lips. The world exploded. For the men in the valley, reality was torn apart in a blinding flash and a deafening roar. An RPG, fired from the high ground, slammed into the rock wall just ahead of the column, showering them with superheated shrapnel and pulverized rock. The disorienting chaos was absolute. The concussion wave picked men up and threw them like dolls. The sound of the blast, trapped and multiplied by the canyon walls, was a physical blow, a solid wall of noise that shattered eardrums and rattled teeth. Before the ringing in their ears had even begun, it was replaced by a new sound, the terrifying, deafening storm of incoming fire. Muzzle flashes winked into existence from dozens of points on the canyon walls, a constellation of death. The air, once thin and cold, was now thick with the hot, metallic sleet of a perfectly executed, three-sided ambush. In the Joint Operations Center, the sterile, controlled environment was brutally violated. The crisp helmet cam feed dissolved into a blinding sheet of white light, then a chaotic blizzard of digital static. The audio channel, which had been filled with the quiet sounds of the team's movement, erupted in a single deafening electronic screech, the sound of technology being murdered. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. Silence. Not the watchful silence of before, but the dead, empty silence of a severed connection. On the main screen, the neat row of friendly blue icons, the symbols of life and progress, began to blink. They pulsed once, twice, in a frantic blood red. Then, one after another, they winked out. Raptor, gone. Grizzly, gone. Rookie, gone. Within 3 seconds, the entire team was erased from the map. In their place, a single stark message flashed in large, ominous letters that seemed to burn into the screen, an epitaph written in cold, digital font, "Signal lost." For a single, suspended second, the war room was utterly silent. It was a moment of collective disbelief, 100 minds refusing to process the information their eyes were seeing. The air hung thick and heavy, the low hum of the servers the only sound in a room that had suddenly become a tomb. Then the spell broke. The room exploded into a flurry of controlled chaos. "Comms, get me a status update. Re-establish contact with Trident now," an officer shouted, his voice tight with panic. Switching to alternate frequencies. "Trying burst transmission," a technician yelled back, his fingers flying across a keyboard. "Satellite, I want eyes on that valley. Give me a live feed. Thermal, anything." Commander Wyatt Thorne stood frozen amidst the storm, a statue of shock. His face, moments before alight with smug satisfaction, was now a ghastly ashen mask. His eyes were locked on the 2 words that had just vaporized his world: signal lost. The letters seemed to pulse with the last heartbeats of his men. His confidence, his authority, his entire sense of self had been built on a foundation of control, and in an instant, that foundation had been turned to dust. The plan, his plan, had not just failed, it had led his men into a slaughterhouse. With a guttural roar of pure, undiluted rage, he ripped his headset off, the cord snapping taut, and slammed it down onto the console before him. The crack of the heavy plastic shattering against the metal surface was like a gunshot. A sharp, violent report that sliced through the panicked din and caused every head to turn. His knuckles, where his hand was still clenched on the broken headset, were bone white. Slowly he straightened up and turned, his movements stiff, robotic. His eyes, wild with a terrifying cocktail of shock, fear, and a dawning, horrifying realization, scanned the room. He didn't see the faces of his subordinates. He didn't hear their frantic shouts. He was a drowning man searching for a piece of wreckage, for something, anything, that could explain how the sea had suddenly swallowed him whole. His gaze swept past the frantic technicians and the pale, wide-eyed officers until it finally landed on her. Leah Torres was still sitting at her console, an island of grim stillness in the swirling chaos. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin, hard line, but her expression was one of grim, awful resolution. There was no triumph in her eyes, no hint of, "I told you so." There was only the cold, heavy certainty of a prophet who had just watched her darkest vision come to pass. Thorne took a single, staggering step towards her, his body trembling with a volatile mixture of fury and dread. He raised a shaking hand, his finger pointing at her as if she were an apparition, the ghost responsible for the massacre. His voice, when it came, was not a question, but a raw, ragged roar that cut through every other sound in the room, a cry of pure, uncomprehending agony. "Who the hell is she?" The room fell silent again, the commander's roar echoing in the sudden void. Every eye, which had been on Thorne, now followed his shaking finger to the quiet analyst in the corner. Into that silence, a new voice spoke, calm and cold as ice. Colonel Jacobs stepped forward from the shadows, placing himself between Thorne and Leah's console. He didn't raise his voice, yet his words carried the weight of iron and landed with the force of a physical blow. each one a nail in the coffin of Thorne's command. "That's Analyst Leah Torres, Commander," Jacob said, his voice devoid of any emotion save for a chilling final authority. "She built the strike grid they're using, the one that predicted this ambush down to the second." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, letting their full weight settle on Thorne's shoulders. Then he delivered the final, devastating strike, the one you chose to ignore. The accusation, unspoken but deafening, hung in the air. The entire room, which had revered Thorne as a demigod of war just minutes before, now stared, their expressions shifting from panic to a dawning, horrified understanding. The power dynamic in the room didn't just shift, it shattered and reformed in an instant. The center of gravity was no longer the swaggering SEAL commander, but the quiet, pale woman at the secondary console. The camera of the mind focused on Thorne's face, capturing the brutal sequence of emotions that warred across his features. First, the raw shock of the attack. Then, the furious denial that his plan could have been so wrong. That denial now curdled into a deep, gut-wrenching dread as Jacob's words sank in. The weight of his decision, of his pride, of his arrogance crashed down on him with the force of a physical impact. He saw the faces of his men, not as blue icons on a screen, but as they were in life, laughing, joking, trusting him. He had failed them. His pride had walked them into a kill box. The lives of those men were on his hands. Leah felt the weight of every stare in the room, but she barely registered them. There was no triumph in her, no satisfaction in being proven so horribly right. There was only a cold, hollow ache in the pit of her stomach. The faces of the soldiers, men she had never met, but for whom she felt an overwhelming, crushing responsibility, flashed in her mind. The grid had shown her the threat, but she had failed to make them believe. The problem was no longer theoretical, a game of percentages and probabilities on a screen. It was a disaster of blood and steel in a dark valley halfway across the world. And in the cold, grim certainty of that moment, she knew her work was not over. It had just begun. The silence in the Joint Operations Center was a physical presence, a thick, heavy blanket smothering the panicked energy of moments before. Colonel Jacobs's words hung in the air, an indictment that needed no further explanation. Every eye was fixed on Commander Thorne, watching the collapse of a man who had, until this moment, seemed infallible. He stood trembling, not from fear, but from the seismic shock of his own failure. The raw fury had evaporated, leaving behind the cold, heavy dregs of responsibility. He took a breath, then another, his gaze slowly, deliberately, moving from Jacob's stony face to the woman at the console, Leah. Then, he began to walk. It was not the confident, predatory stride of before. Each step was slow, deliberate, heavy, the sound of his boots on the polished floor marking a funereal procession toward the corner of the room that had suddenly become its nexus of power. The other officers parted before him, their faces a mixture of awe and pity. They were watching more than just a commander approaching an analyst. They were witnessing a symbolic pilgrimage, a surrender of the old guard to the new. He stopped directly behind her chair, close enough to feel the faint warmth from her monitors. For the first time, he truly looked at her screen. It was not the simple, sterile chart of probabilities he had imagined. It was a living, breathing organism of light and information, a maelstrom of data. The main display showed the Serpent's Tooth Valley, but it was a version of reality he had never seen. The red probability stain that Jacobs had glimpsed was now a pulsing, bleeding wound covering the choke point, but radiating out from it were thousands of shimmering lines, vectors of possibility. The grid was running hundreds of simulations per second, calculating survival odds for every potential escape route. It was tracking the enemy's movements, not as icons, but as flowing currents of red, predicting their flanking maneuvers, their containment patterns, their search grids. And amidst that sea of red, a handful of tiny blue dots, no longer icons but flickering embers of life, representing the survivors. The system was receiving faint, intermittent telemetry from their damaged gear, the digital ghosts of their biometric sensors and GPS units, and from these faint whispers. It was constructing a map of their exact locations, their heart rates, their physical status. He saw it all, the sheer staggering complexity and intelligence of her creation. He finally understood. He hadn't just dismissed a person, he had dismissed a new form of warfare, a sixth sense that could see the entire battlefield in 4 dimensions. His gut, his experience. It was a candle in the face of this digital sun. His arrogance crumbled, burned to ash by the undeniable truth on her screen. All that was left was a raw, desperate plea, the plea of a commander who had lost his way and would do anything to save his men. He leaned forward, his voice low, strained, stripped of all its former authority. It was the voice of a drowning man. "Can you find them?" he asked, his eyes locked on the flickering blue embers. "Can you get them out?" Leah did not turn. Her focus remained absolute, her gaze fixed on the deadly puzzle in front of her. Her fingers moved across her keyboard, her commands swift and precise, coaxing more information from the faint signals, refining the escape simulations. The anxiety that had been a cold knot in her stomach was gone, burned away in the crucible of the disaster. In its place was a hyper-focused calm, a chilling clarity of purpose. The theoretical problem was now a live, deadly game of chess, and she was the only one on their side who could see the whole board. "Finding them isn't the problem, Commander," she said, her voice as hard and clear as diamond. This was her territory now. "The grid is still receiving telemetry from their gear, even if comms are down. I know exactly where they are, how many are still effective, and what the enemy is doing." She paused, letting the weight of her next words sink in, a clear and deliberate assertion of the new chain of command. "I can guide them out, but it has to be my way. No deviations, no gut feelings. You have to trust the data, and you have to trust me, every second." For Thorne, there was no hesitation. It was a complete and total surrender, an abdication of the pride that had cost him so much. His only path to redemption, the only hope for his men, was to place his faith and their lives in the hands of the woman he had so publicly ridiculed. He straightened up, took a half step back, and gave the only order he had left to give. "Do it," he said, his voice resonating with the ghost of his former command, but now directed at her. "The floor is yours." The words echoed in the silent room. The shift was complete. Leah's internal world narrowed to a single point of intense focus. The weight of responsibility was immense, a mountain on her shoulders, but it did not crush her. It sharpened her mind to a razor's edge. "Comms," she snapped, her voice ringing with an authority that no one dared question. "I need a direct interface with the team's tactical displays. The wrist, mounted GPS units. I don't need audio, I need to push raw navigation data. A one-way data burst link, now." The chief communications technician, a man who 15 minutes ago wouldn't have given her the time of day, scrambled to comply. "Yes, ma'am, working on it." On the ground, hell had a name, and it was the Serpent's Tooth. Raptor had managed to rally the survivors behind a small outcrop of rock that offered pathetic cover. There were only 4 of them left, 4 out of 12. Grizzly was gone, vaporized by the initial RPG blast. Rookie was bleeding out from a wound in his leg, his face pale in the intermittent glare of muzzle flashes. They were pinned down, taking effective fire from at least 3 sides, the bullets chipping away at their meager sanctuary, each impact a sharp reminder of how little time they had left. Their comms were fried, the sophisticated electronics reduced to useless junk by the initial blast. They were cut off, surrounded, and dying. They were preparing for their last stand, a final defiant act of violence before the darkness took them. Raptor checked his rifle, his movements automatic, his mind a cold, grim ledger of their remaining assets. 3 full magazines for himself, 2 for the other effective fire team member. Rookie was down to his sidearm. It wasn't enough. It wouldn't be enough. He looked at the faces of his men, saw their fear, their exhaustion, and their unbreakable resolve. They would die here, but they would die like seals. He gripped his rifle, ready to sell his life dearly. Then, a vibration. He glanced down at his wrist. The tactical display, which had been a dead black screen since the ambush began, was alive. It buzzed again, a faint, insistent pulse against his skin. On the screen, a simple pixelated arrow had appeared. It glowed with a soft blue light, a beacon in the violent darkness. It was pointing towards what looked like a solid rock wall, a sheer cliff face 20 meters to their left. Below the arrow, a timer appeared, its numbers stark white against the black background. Move in 30. Raptor stared, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. A ghost in the machine. It was impossible. Their comms were down. The network was gone. Yet, here it was, a message from a world they were no longer connected to. He had a choice, a terrible binary choice. Trust his own eyes, which told him the arrow was pointing them towards a dead end, a place where they would be trapped and slaughtered against unyielding stone. Or trust the ghost, trust the impossible signal. His mind flashed back to the briefing, the quiet analyst in the corner, the 92% probability, the 3D model of this exact spot. She had been right. She had seen this, had predicted it down to the last, bloody detail. If she had been right about the trap, maybe, just maybe, she was right about the way out. The timer on his wrist ticked down. 20. It wasn't a choice between his eyes and a machine. It was a choice between dying here for certain or taking a leap of faith on the only lifeline they had. In the JOC, Leah watched the timer on her own screen count down. She had found a back door, a low-frequency data protocol buried in the GPS unit's firmware, a maintenance channel that the enemy's jamming hadn't touched. It was a tiny straw, but it was enough. She had plotted a course, a desperate, improbable path through the chaos. She saw the enemy's movements as pulsing red vectors on her grid, a flowing, swirling sea of bullets and death. She saw her team as 4 tiny, flickering blue lights. Her keyboard was her rudder, her mouse a sextant. She was a digital Moses, and she was about to part a Red Sea. The tension in the room was unbearable. Thorne, Jacobs, and every other officer stood frozen, their eyes glued to the screen, waiting to see if the men on the ground would obey the strange, disembodied instructions. The timer hit 10. Raptor made the call. He looked at his 2 remaining able-bodied men. "We got a ghost!" he yelled over the cacophony of gunfire. "Command is talking through the GPS. It's the only way out." He pointed towards the solid rock wall. "On my mark, we move to these coordinates. We lay down covering fire, and we run. Go." The timer hit 0. As one, the 3 SEALs rose from behind their cover, unleashing a torrent of suppressive fire towards the enemy positions. Under the cover of this desperate final fusillade, they grabbed the wounded rookie and sprinted, not away from the enemy, but sideways, towards the solid wall of rock, towards the pixelated arrow, towards a leap of faith in a ghost they couldn't see and a woman they had never met. The sprint was an act of collective madness. Bullets chewed at the rock behind them, the air alive with the angry hornet, buzz of near misses. Raptor's lungs burned, the thin mountain air searing his throat. He held the wounded rookie's weight, his own muscles screaming in protest. His focus narrowed to the glowing blue arrow on his wrist and the sheer, impassive face of the rock wall ahead. It was a suicidal charge into a dead end. His tactical mind, the part of him forged in 2 decades of combat, screamed that this was wrong, that cover and concealment were life. But another part of him, a newer, more desperate instinct, trusted the ghost. It trusted the analyst who had seen their deaths coming. They slammed into the rock face, expecting the brutal, bone-jarring impact of solid stone. Instead, they stumbled through a curtain of thick, hanging vines that had perfectly concealed a narrow fissure, a dark slash in the cliff, no wider than a man's shoulders. It was a smuggler's hole, an ancient passage invisible from more than a few feet away. They plunged into the absolute darkness of the tunnel, just as the first enemy fighters rounded the rock outcrop they had abandoned, their rifles searching for targets that had vanished into thin air. Inside, the world shrank to the confines of the suffocating passage. The air was cold and damp, thick with the smell of wet earth and stone. The only light was the faint, ethereal blue glow from Raptor's wrist display, casting long, dancing shadows that turned the rough-hewn walls into a gallery of monstrous shapes. The only sounds were their own ragged, gasping breaths, the scuff of their boots on the gritty floor, and the slow, steady drip of water from somewhere deep within the mountain. It was a tomb, a claustrophobic, terrifying tomb. But the blue arrow urged them on, a single point of certainty in the crushing dark. In the JOC, a collective gasp went through the room. On the main screen, the 3 blue embers representing the survivors had moved directly into a solid gray block of the topographical map. They had disappeared. "Where did they go?" a junior officer whispered, his voice trembling. "There's nothing there." Thorne didn't answer. He stared at Leah's screen, where the grid showed a different reality. It displayed the faint, branching lines of the tunnel network, a hidden circulatory system within the mountain that existed on no official chart. The blue embers were moving steadily through these secret veins. He watched, his heart pounding, as red icons, the enemy search parties, swarmed the area where the SEALs had vanished, their movements chaotic and confused. They were searching the kill box, completely oblivious to the fact that their prey was now moving directly beneath their feet. He turned to Jacobs, his voice a hushed, awestruck whisper that was lost in the low hum of the servers. "She's not just getting them out," he breathed, his eyes wide with a dawning, profound understanding. "She's putting them on the offensive. She sees the whole battlefield." For what felt like an eternity, the SEALs navigated the labyrinth. The tunnel twisted and turned, sometimes forcing them to crawl on their hands and knees. Twice the blue arrow on Raptor's display pulsed, signaling them to halt. They would freeze in the darkness, pressing themselves against the cold, damp rock, listening as the heavy tread of enemy boots passed on the surface directly above them, the sound muffled but terrifyingly close. In these moments, their trust in the unseen guide became absolute. They were no longer just following instructions. They were communing with a higher power, a guardian angel who saw the unseen and knew the unknowable. They started to think of the presence not as command or a ghost, but as the oracle. Then the arrow changed. It stopped pointing forward and instead pointed up. Above them, a faint circle of slightly less impenetrable darkness. A vertical shaft. With their remaining strength, they pushed and pulled each other up the rough, treacherous climb, emerging one by one from a hole at the top. The relief was instantaneous and overwhelming. They burst from the claustrophobic darkness of the earth into the cold, clean air of the open night. They were on a high, narrow ridge, the same ridge Leah had initially proposed as a safe route. The moon was bright, illuminating a breathtaking panorama. Below them, the entire Serpent's Tooth Valley was laid out like a map on a table. They could see the choke point, the site of the ambush, littered with the debris of the firefight, and they could see the enemy. Dozens of them, moving in disorganized, frustrated search patterns, their flashlights cutting useless beams through the shadows. They had gone from being rats in a trap to eagles in the eyrie. They had achieved a position of absolute tactical dominance. Leah felt a cold, detached intensity. This was not about revenge, it was about geometry. It was a chess game, and she was seeing 10 moves ahead. Her system, the grid, was now intercepting and decrypting the enemy's frantic low-tech radio chatter. It cross-referenced the call signs with the heat signatures and vocal stress patterns, and a clear picture of the enemy's command structure emerged. Their leader, a local warlord, was becoming increasingly agitated, barking orders from a makeshift command post near the valley entrance. The grid highlighted his position, a cluster of heat signatures around a captured coalition vehicle. A new icon appeared on her screen, a small, precise crosshair. With a click of her mouse, she sent it. On the ridge, Raptor's wrist display buzzed one last time. The blue arrow was gone, replaced by a flashing red target icon. The GPS coordinates updated, and he raised his rifle, the high-powered scope automatically slaving to the new designation. He peered through the optic, adjusting the focus. There, 500 meters below, was a group of men clustered around a pickup truck. One man, larger than the others, was waving his arms, his face contorted with rage. He was the one. The Oracle had marked him. Raptor settled the crosshairs of his scope directly over the man's chest. He took a slow, steadying breath, the cold air filling his lungs. He looked over at the other remaining SEAL, who had already acquired his own target in the command group. Their eyes met over the tops of their rifles, a shared, grim understanding passing between them. Payback was a dish best served from a kilometer away, in the cold. A grim smile touched Raptor's lips, a predator's smile. "Well, well," he whispered into his throat mic, a message he knew the Oracle couldn't hear, but which he felt compelled to say anyway. "Look what the magic box found for us. Payback time." The counter attack was not a battle. It was an execution. It was the stark, brutal contrast to the chaotic, panicked firefight they had endured in the valley below. Up here, on the ridge, there was no chaos, only the clinical precision of professionals at work. 2 rifles, 2 shots, fired in perfect synchronicity. The sound, a sharp double crack, was swallowed by the vastness of the mountains. Down below, the warlord and his second, in command, collapsed simultaneously, their frantic shouting cut off in mid. syllable. For a moment, the rest of the command element stood in stunned confusion, looking at their fallen leaders, unable to process where the attack had come from. It was the last moment of confusion they would ever have. Raptor and his teammate worked their bolts with cold efficiency, acquiring and neutralizing new targets with each shot. In less than 10 seconds, the entire enemy command element was eliminated. The effect on the remaining enemy fighters was immediate and catastrophic. The disciplined force that had executed a perfect ambush devolved into a panicked mob. Leaderless, confused, and attacked from an impossible, unseen quarter, they broke. They abandoned their positions and scattered in every direction, their only thought to escape the Valley of Ghosts. In the Jock, Leah's work was not yet done. As the red icons on her grid broke and fled, she became a conductor of a different kind of orchestra. "Air support, this is Grid," she said, her voice calm and even, patched directly through to the air liaison officer. "I have multiple fleeing targets, transmitting coordinates for kinetic strike, grid reference 7, 9er, 3, 4, 5, 6. Danger close protocols. In effect, my team is 500 meters north, elevated, trust the data." The air liaison, a seasoned Air Force captain, hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Grid, be advised, that's inside standard minimums. I need—" "Captain?" Leah cut him off, her voice hardening to steel. "My team is on that ridge. The data is accurate. Every target I give you is a confirmed hostile. Do you copy?" There was a beat of silence. Then, "Copy Grid, coordinates received, engaging." Thorne watched the exchange, mesmerized. He wasn't looking at the main screen anymore, where a drone feed had just come online, showing the fleeing enemy fighters as ghostly white figures running in the dark. He was watching Leah. He saw her calm, focused expression, the absolute certainty in her posture, the way her fingers moved across the keyboard, directing death from half a world away. He was witnessing the birth of a new kind of soldier, a warrior whose battlefield was made of light and logic. She wasn't just an analyst, she was a commander, a strategist, a weapon. The drone feed showed the result of her commands. A stream of fire erupted from the sky, a silent, terrifyingly accurate line of cannon fire that erased a group of fleeing fighters. Leah tracked another group, her voice never wavering as she called in another strike, and then another. It was methodical, relentless, and brutally efficient. She was clearing the board. On the ridge, Raptor and his men watched the fireworks below. They saw the fleeing enemy neutralized with a precision that was breathtaking. The Oracle was cleaning up. The valley fell silent once more, but this time it was the silence of victory. The silence of a battlefield secured. Relief, profound and bone, deep, washed over Raptor. It was a feeling so potent it almost brought him to his knees. He looked at his men, at Rookie, who was now conscious and being tended to, at the other survivor, his face grim but alive. They were battered, they had taken terrible losses, but they were alive, and they had won. Thanks to the Oracle. "Let's go," Raptor said, his voice hoarse. "Let's finish the mission." They made their way carefully down the ridge, their movements slow and exhausted. The original mission objective, the Warlord's command post, was now just a collection of shot, up vehicles, and dead men. They moved through the scene, their training taking over as they gathered the required intelligence, laptops, and documents. The mission was complete. As Raptor slung a captured laptop over his shoulder, he glanced back up at the dark, silent ridge they had descended from. He couldn't see the tunnel entrance, couldn't see the path that had led them from certain death to impossible victory. It was just a dark, impassive mountain. But he knew. He would never look at a mountain, or a map, or a quiet analyst in the back of a room the same way again. The world had changed tonight, and he was alive to see it. The conference room at command headquarters was a world away from the humming, shadowy cavern of the JOC. Here the air was still and smelled of lemon polish and old leather. Sunlight, a foreign concept in Leah's operational world, streamed through tall, mullioned windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and glinting off the polished brass nameplates arranged on the vast mahogany table. It was a room built for judgment, its wood-paneled walls having absorbed the weight of decades of difficult decisions and career-ending reports. Seated around the table was a panel of generals, men with stars on their shoulders and faces carved from years of command, their expressions ranging from impatient to skeptical. They were the old guard, men who, like Thorne, had built their careers on instinct and experience. Colonel Jacobs sat slightly back from the main table, his posture relaxed, but his eyes missing nothing. Leah had been asked, or rather, ordered to attend. She sat in a chair against the back wall, as far from the center of power as she could get, feeling profoundly out of place in her simple gray suit. She wished she were back in her office, back with the comforting absolute logic of her data streams. The door opened and Commander Thorne entered. He was in his dress uniform, the crisp white fabric a stark contrast to the grimy flight suit he had worn during the operation. He moved with a new kind of gravity, his former swagger replaced by a somber, measured purpose. He walked to the head of the table, placed his cover down, and stood at perfect attention, his eyes sweeping over the panel of generals. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice clear and steady, devoid of the raw emotion of the night before, but carrying a new, heavier resonance. "I am here to deliver the after-action report for Operation Serpent's Tooth." He took a breath. "The operation was a failure of command, my command. I was given accurate, actionable intelligence predicting a complex ambush, and I chose to disregard it. My experience told me the plan was sound. My pride told me I knew better. I was wrong on both counts." A stunned silence fell over the room. The generals exchanged uneasy glances. They were accustomed to commanders who blamed faulty intelligence, equipment failure, or bad luck. They were not accustomed to this, a full-throated, unequivocal acceptance of personal failure. "As a direct result of my decision," Thorne continued, his voice unwavering, "SEAL Team Trident walked into a perfectly executed kill box. We lost 8 men, good men." He recited their names, each one a hammer blow in the quiet room. "Their loss was not a result of enemy action. It was a result of my arrogance. The responsibility for their deaths is mine, and mine alone." He paused, letting the weight of his confession settle. He then picked up a remote, and a new image appeared on the large screen behind him. It was the 3D model from the grid, the one Leah had shown him, with the red lines of the kill box and the safe, alternate route along the ridge. "This is the prediction that was presented to me 3 hours before insertion by Analyst Leah Torres," he said, his voice shifting from confession to testimony. "It predicted the ambush location, the enemy's strategy, and the outcome with 92% accuracy. In truth, its only error was in not accounting for the sheer scale of the enemy force, a variable that was unknowable with the assets we had. It was, for all intents and purposes, perfect." He then clicked the remote again, and the screen changed to show the GPS track of the surviving team members, the impossible path through the smuggler's tunnel, the ascent to the ridge, and the clinical, precise counterattack. He walked the stunned generals through the rest of the operation, not from his perspective, but from hers. He described how Leah, using nothing but faint telemetry signals and the predictive power of her system, had become the team's eyes, ears, and tactical mind. He explained how she had guided the survivors through a hidden tunnel network, placed them in a position of tactical dominance, identified the enemy commander, and directed the air support that had neutralized the remaining threat and secured the mission objective. "The lives of the men we lost are on my hands," Thorne said, his voice thick with emotion, but his gaze steady. He turned and looked directly to the back of the room, his eyes finding Leah's. It was a clear, public acknowledgement of his debt, a transfer of credit in front of the highest authorities. "The lives of the men we saved and the successful completion of the mission are on hers." He turned back to the panel. Analyst Torres did not just provide data, she provided leadership. "When all contact was lost, when my team was cut off and facing annihilation, she took command. She commanded that operation from a keyboard, flawlessly from 6,000 miles away. Therefore, I am formally recommending that Analyst Leah Torres be awarded the Distinguished Civilian Service Award, the highest honor this department can bestow for exceptional bravery and life-saving action. Furthermore, I am recommending that her system, the grid, be immediately and fully integrated into all Special Operations mission planning, effective immediately. We have been given a glimpse of the future of warfare. To ignore it again would not just be foolish, it would be criminally negligent." He finished, standing ramrod straight, his report concluded. The generals were speechless, staring from Thorne to the screen, and then to the small, unassuming woman in the back of the room. Leah shrank from their collective gaze, a hot flush of discomfort rising on her neck. The praise was a foreign language she didn't understand. Her mind was already elsewhere, replaying the data from the operation, searching for the variables she had missed, the tiny flicker of information that would have raised the probability from 92% to 100. She was thinking about the 8 men whose names Thorne had read, and how she could improve the system to ensure that the next list of names would be shorter. From his seat, Colonel Jacobs watched her, a quiet, proud smile touching his lips. His faith had been vindicated on the highest possible level. That night, Leah's office was an oasis of quiet focus. The small Spartan room was her true home, its whiteboards covered not with pictures or mementos, but with the elegant, esoteric language of complex algorithms. She was hunched over her keyboard, the glow of her monitor illuminating the intense concentration on her face. The mission was over, the reports were filed, but for her, the work was never done. She was deep inside the grid's code, analyzing the terabytes of data from the Serpent's Tooth operation. She had found it, a subtle correlation between the enemy's encrypted radio silence and a specific pattern of microseismic activity. It was a new variable, a new layer of prediction. She was already incorporating it, refining the system, making it stronger, faster, more certain. She was building a better shield. A soft knock on her open door broke her concentration. She looked up, startled. Commander Thorne stood in the doorway, hesitant, as if unsure of his right to enter her space. He was back in a simple flight suit, the formal uniform of the debriefing gone. He looked tired, the events of the last 24 hours having carved new lines into his face. He said nothing, but walked slowly into the room. He stopped beside her desk and looked at the equation scrawled across her whiteboard, his expression one of quiet awe, like a man looking at the blueprints of creation. He then reached into the pocket of his flight suit and placed something on her desk next to her keyboard. The object landed with a soft, heavy clink. It was a coin, a single heavy bronze coin, its surface worn smooth in places. In its center was the iconic emblem of the Navy SEALs, the eagle with its wings spread, clutching a trident, a flintlock pistol, and an anchor. A SEAL trident. It was not a medal, not a formal award. It was something more. It was the ultimate symbol of respect and belonging. A token given by team members to those they considered one of their own. A gesture of brotherhood that was never offered lightly. He looked at her, his eyes holding a depth of gratitude and transformed respect that no speech could ever convey. "What you did," he said, his voice low and rough with an emotion he couldn't fully suppress. "There are no words. Thank you, Leah." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, then turned to leave. His part said, the gesture made. "Commander," Leah's voice stopped him at the door. He turned back. She had picked up the coin, its surprising weight a solid, tangible reality in her hand. She looked from the trident to him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she gave a small nod of her own, a quiet acknowledgement of the immense significance of the gift. "Just doing my job." "Commander," she said, her voice soft but firm. She placed the coin carefully on the desk beside her monitor, a bronze sentinel watching over her work. "Now, we need to figure out how to make sure this never happens again." A faint smile touched Thorne's lips. It was a look of profound, unshakable respect. He no longer saw an analyst, a civilian, a woman in a pantsuit. He saw a warrior, one who fought on a battlefield he was only just beginning to understand. He nodded once more, a silent agreement, and then he was gone, leaving her alone in the quiet glow of her screens. The story ended there, in that quiet room. Leah's gaze lingered on the bronze coin for a moment, its solid presence a stark contrast to the ethereal world of data she inhabited. It was a symbol of the lives she had saved, but also a reminder of the ones she hadn't. She picked it up again, feeling its weight, the history it contained. Then, with a quiet sense of purpose, she set it down. Her expression was unchanged, her focus absolute. The mission was over, but for her, the work was never done. She turned back to her screen, her fingers finding the keyboard, already focused on the next threat, the next puzzle, the next set of lives to save. The war was endless, and she was its silent, eternal guardian.